Hi, I am Sherlock. Welcome to my new mystery case.
I have often remarked that the cases which begin with a flavour of the supernatural are those in which my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes displays his powers to the greatest advantage, for it is then that credulity must be pared away from fact and panic from evidence. Such a case descended upon Baker Street on an evening when the rain had beaten all day against the windows, and the street lamps showed long wind-torn lances of light upon a glistening roadway. The fire had burned low, and Holmes, with his knees drawn up beneath him in the armchair, was applying his bow to a violin phrase so delicate that even the rain seemed to hush and listen, when there came a hurried tread upon the stairs and a rap at the door that was both timid and desperate. "Come in," cried Holmes without rising. The door opened to admit a gentleman whose breeding was apparent even beneath his agitation. He was of middle height, spare, with a neat grey moustache and those hawk-like features which suggest a life spent in command. The rain had plastered his cloak to his shoulders, his hat, fedora-shaped and felt, he clutched in gloved hands that trembled. "Colonel Wetherall," said Holmes, drawing the bow across the strings in a final whisper of sound. "Late of the 27th, accustomed to early chapel and cold barrack yards, and within the past hour a witness, if not with the eye, then with the imagination, of a circumstance which has set your very bones at a quake. Watson, pray stir the fire. Colonel, take the chair. It is warmer there." Our visitor glanced at me with a start. Then the signs of surprise yielded to a species of relief. "You know me, Mr. Holmes?" "I know of you," Holmes returned, tossing his violin negligently upon the table. "And I see your sleeve is dusted with a fine grey powder that has not the crystalline sparkle of plaster, nor the duller grain of brick, but the friable softness of weathered limestone. London possesses many such stones, but there is a profusion of them at St. Bartholomew's burial ground, and again at the older part of Kensal Green and Highgate. Your boots, if you will allow, yes, the slit edged with damp turf, and a seed from a yew. Pray begin." "Then I have come to the right man," said the Colonel. He swallowed, and the knuckles of one glove whitened upon the other. "Mr. Holmes, a young lady has vanished, sir, before the eyes of two men who swear that for the breadth of a breath she stood between the graves of her parents, and then was gone as if the earth had taken her back." "Steady, Colonel," said I. "You have been greatly shaken." "I am not ashamed to confess it, Doctor." He turned those military eyes upon us in a manner which sought facts and feared them. "Her name is Miss Eliza Wetherall, my brother's child. She is 19, spirited but dutiful, and since my brother's death has resided with my sister-in-law at our house in Little Venice. This afternoon, at the insistence of the household, she went to Highgate Cemetery to lay fresh flowers upon my brother's grave. She was accompanied by our butler, Ford, a trustworthy creature of 30 years' service, and by a young curate who has lately been attentive in our parish, one Mr. Adrian Hargreave. Holmes moved not at all, but his eyes had that far-off glitter which I had come to know. Proceed." They entered the cemetery shortly after 4. Rain threatened, and the sky was lowering. Ford remained at the path's edge, while my niece and the curate advanced into the older ground, where the stones lean like sleepers, and the yews drip perpetually. There are 2 graves together, my brother's and my sister-in-law's first husbands. An unhappy arrangement of our family history, which I need not now explain. Miss Eliza placed her flowers upon my brother's stone. She stood, God help me between the two. The curate says he had turned but an instant, no more than to draw from his pocket a handkerchief, and when he looked again, she was gone. There was no cry, there was no sound but the rain on the leaves. Holmes steepled his fingers. And Ford? Ford asserts he never removed his eyes from the place where she stood. He is prepared to swear that he saw the hem of her cloak shiver as if seized from below. Then nothing. They ran to the spot. The earth was wet. There were her footprints, plain as a typewritten line, and, this is the horror, between the graves a strip of ground, perhaps 2 feet wide, showed the mark of a heel turned inward upon itself, as if she had pivoted in the very act of vanishing. There were no further impressions leading away. "None, Mr. Holmes." Holmes drew a slow breath. No marks of dragging, no signs of disturbance in the turf, beyond this peculiar rotary impression. So the curate insists. Ford is less exact in his speech, but no less emphatic. They searched, they called, they roused the keeper. Scotland Yard was summoned. Inspector Lestrade himself attended. He has put a cordon on the older ground and is of the opinion that Miss Eliza has either fled in some fit of girlish folly, or that she slipped, though there is nowhere there to slip, but into the past. "Lestrade has a poetical turn when the rain is upon him," murmured Holmes. "You say the graves are side by side. Are they alike in construction?" "As alike as twins, save that my brother's stone bears a Latin motto from his school days, and the other is plain, its letters eaten by weather." "Any vaulting below? Catacombs? Drainage?" "The keeper says those older plots are simple earth graves with brick lining, no vaults. The ground is known to settle treacherously, but not to swallow a living soul in the time it takes a curate to sneeze." Holmes rose then and crossed to the window. He drew back the curtain and watched the rain. "You apprehend, of course, that there is a third possibility besides elopement and enchantment." "Abduction," said the colonel hoarsely. "But how from such a place in such a fashion, and before witnesses?" "How indeed?" Holmes returned softly. He turned back, his face all edges and lucidity. "What else, Colonel?" "I had a note not 2 hours before I came to you." He fumbled in the inner pocket of his cloak and produced a small envelope, wrinkled by damp, but intact. Holmes held out the poker tongs with an almost playful gravity, and the colonel laid the envelope upon them. Holmes brought it to the light and sniffed. "Violet scent," said he. "A cheap sort. The gum was not licked, but applied with a brush. The paper is of the kind sold in stationers catering to governesses and clerks. Watson, your lens." The note within was brief, printed in a hand that laboured to be anonymous. "If you wish the girl between the graves to breathe daylight again, say nothing to the police. Await instruction. Midnight sounds best among the stones." It was signed with a small device, a pair of parallel lines crossed midway by a third, the whole like the crude sketch of a ladder. "A childish emblem," said I. "A studied one," said Holmes. "It is the cheap perfume that most damns it. Our correspondent wishes us to believe in a woman's involvement. That is precisely why I do not." "But she lives?" The colonel leaned forward. Holmes's gaze softened by a hair's breadth. "That, sir, is the one consolatory deduction I permit myself. Men who intend a murder do not write about daylight. They write of silence and of graves. This writer speaks of air. Miss Eliza lives at this hour." The colonel's hand went to his brow and came away trembling. "Then you will come, Mr. Holmes. You will see the ground as it stands. Lestrade has fixed lanterns and left a constable." Holmes's smile was a thin line. "Lestrade is an admirable keeper of lanterns. Watson, your coat. Colonel, you must answer 2 more questions on the way. First, why are there 2 graves for one family history? Second, who profits if Miss Eliza Wetherall is made to seem an unchaste fool in the public prints?" "You shall have both answers," the colonel said, rising. "Only do not ask me to hold my tongue till midnight. I am an old soldier, Mr. Holmes, and not adept at obedience when my blood is up. Holmes took his hat and the thin black cane he favoured on wet nights. I shall not ask you to hold your tongue. I shall merely require you to keep your eyes open. Between two graves, Colonel, one sees double, and yet there is always a third thing that is neither stone. He glanced at the note again. That ridiculous ladder. Come, Watson, there is mud to read and lies to weigh, and the rain, I think, will assist us. The rain had settled to a fine, insinuating drizzle by the time our cab drew up at the north gate of Highgate. A constable's cape shone like lacquer in the lamplight. Beyond him, the yews received the mist as a veil receives tears. Colonel Wetherall strode ahead, his indignation giving him a soldier's energy, while Holmes, light as thistledown, seemed to drift rather than walk, his head slightly bowed, his eyes travelling with that feline economy that misses nothing and appears to stare at nothing at all. Lanterns burned at intervals along the winding path, their yellow pools gaunt upon the tilted stones, and there, in the older ground, we found Lestrade with his hands behind him, and his nose, as ever, in the air like a terrier's when the scent is puzzling. "So you have come to see our miracle, Mr. Holmes," said he, with a dryness which made the word almost respectful. "You'll not deny we've had stranger tales, but I don't recall the ground ever swallowing a lady out from under the church's very eyelids." "The ground," Holmes answered, "is often more accommodating to scoundrels than the church, Inspector. You have kept the place untouched." "As near as can be in this weather. The curate and the butler are at the keeper's hut. I've taken their statements. We raised the turf with 2 fingers where the marks are, just to see if a rabbit's burrow might run under. Nothing. Brick lining below, firm enough." Holmes knelt between the graves. The lantern Lestrade held lit a strip of green no wider than a hearth-rug, glistening with beads of water. There, very plain, were the small, neat impressions of a lady's boots coming along the left-hand stone to the midpoint, where indeed the grass showed a curious twist, as if a heel had rotated in place and pressed the blades into a faint spiral. "Watson," said Holmes softly, "your handkerchief." He laid the linen flat upon the grass, aligning one corner with the heel's pivot, then drew from his pocket a slim ivory rule and measured from the hem of the left-hand gravestone to the pivot point, and thence to the right-hand stone. He noted the figures in his mind, and with the faintest grimace of distaste, bent so low that a drop of moisture trembled upon the point of his nose before falling to merge with its fellows on the turf. He inhaled once, twice, delicately, as a man considers a wine. "Violet," he murmured, "and not of the same bottle as the note. This is finer. You see, Lestrade, the cheap scent bears a raw, sugary top, a confectioner's deceit. This," he parted the blades with a fingernail, "is the remainder of a better essence which does not cling to letters, but to— ah." He lifted a hair, so light and pale it was little more than a glimmer between his finger and thumb. "Fair," he said, "and not shed long since." "A lady's hair," said Lestrade with a short laugh. "If that is our clue, I can give you 50 ladies' hairs in 50 paces. This is a burying ground, Mr. Holmes." "Just so. And yet the rain is a severe critic of old traces. It is kinder to those of an hour's age." He let the hair float, watched it fall, and adhere to a drop on the grass. Then he shifted, and his finger touched the very edge of the right-hand stone. "Colonel, your brother's motto, if you please." The colonel, whose agitation had grown quiet under the slow ritual of Holmes's attention, looked down. "Quoteniam. By what shall I hold?" it reads. He was fond of his Horace. Holmes's eyes did not leave the stone. "And the other is plain and weather-eaten." "Your first husband's grave, madam." He said it not to the colonel, but as if to the stone itself. Hargreave tells us he looked away to a handkerchief. Ford tells us he never looked away at all. Both agree Miss Eliza stood centred exactly here. Yet she could not have gone forward without leaving sign upon the banked sod, nor backward without brushing the yew. Sideways. He pressed, not at the middle of the turf, but at a margin where the right-hand stone's base met earth. The grass yielded a hair's breadth and then was firm. He did the same at the left, firm also. Then, very lightly, he tapped with his knuckle, once upon the right-hand stone, once upon the left. The left answered with the dull integrity of settled masonry. The right gave back a note with a faint, hollow timbre. Lestrade bent, his sharp eyes narrowing. "A sounding trick, is it? And what do you make of it?" "That the plain stone has a cavity beneath the portion nearest the strip," Holmes replied. "Not a vault in the undertaker's sense, but a void, sufficient to change the behaviour of the earth immediately adjacent. Observe the spiral impression, not the mark of a foot taken away, but of a foot that turned because the supporting surface beneath altered its level in the instant of weight, as if a narrow flap gave way, then returned." "You mean a trap?" Lestrade exclaimed. "A word favoured on stages and in penny dreadfuls, but a mechanism is a mechanism however named. Have you the kindness to bring your lantern close? So, Watson, your lens again." He scraped at the blade ends where turf kissed stone, and revealed, to my growing astonishment, a hairline trace, no more than a seam, running for perhaps 18 inches along the very edge of the right-hand stone, and then describing a neat right angle toward the centre of the grass. "Cut turf," said Holmes. "Replaced. The rain has swollen it shut, but not erased the geometry. Whoever contrived it counted upon the old ground's forgivable irregularity to hide a carpenter's precision. Lestrade, give me that reed." The inspector produced a thin withy from the hedge. Holmes slid it down at the seam. For a space it would not go, and then, with a little twitch that I felt in my teeth, it slipped and disappeared to the length of a hand before meeting resistance. "Brick lining below," Lestrade muttered. "You said so yourself." "Brick does not prevent a thief from removing 2 or 3 courses and inserting a plank," Holmes returned. He rose, brushed his knee, and let his glance travel the stones around us, as if the graves themselves were faces at a window. Where does one hide the act of carpentry? Not here where mourners pass, not in the open path. There, look, Watson, at the base of the stone angel 3 plots down. Fresh limes splash on the pedestal, and the smear upon the grass where a board rested before being carried. The smear runs toward the keeper's yard. And what is that caught in the angel's wing? I fetched it, a short fibre of coarse brown twine, tarry to the touch. Holmes took it, smiled without amusement, and slipped it into his pocket-case beside the pale hair. "Colonel," said he, "who besides your household had knowledge of Miss Eliza's visit?" "No one beyond Ford and the curate," the colonel answered, "unless the maid who laid out her cloak chattered. We shall account for chatter later. For the present, let us hear Mr. Hargreave on the subject of handkerchiefs." He turned to Lestrade. "If you have done with your poetical comparisons, Inspector, indulge me. Bring them both." Lestrade's look said he would sooner collar a ferret than fetch a curate for Holmes's questions, but he went. Left to ourselves, we stood in a silence made more intimate by the tiny hiss of lantern wicks. Holmes's hand, resting on his cane, tapped once upon the stone, a thought knocking within his skull. "You have a notion?" I ventured. "I have a shape," he said. "The details will file themselves where they belong, when I have taken the measure of the curate's honesty and the butler's memory." This is not the work of earth. It is the work of men practiced in the unmaking of earth. Gravediggers are paid to open. There are, alas, others who have sometimes been paid to open without the Church's blessing. The little ladder on the note, did you take it, Watson, for a child's device? I am not sure it is not a craftsman's signature. Then Miss Eliza lives, as I said. If the earth swallows at a man's word, the same word, or the right pressure on a board, will spit her out. He glanced down the path where Lestrade's lantern bobbed nearer, escorting two dark figures. Let us hear the Reverend upon the theology of glances averted, precision of time, precision of posture. Those are the rails upon which this train runs, and we shall see presently who laid them. Lestrade returned with the curate and the butler, two figures so dissimilar in carriage that they might have come from different worlds. Mr. Hargreave, the young clergyman, was tall, thin and tremulous, with a pale face half obscured by the brim of a soaked hat, and eyes that darted like startled fish from shadow to shadow. His collar had lost its starch, and a streak of mud ran down his sleeve, as though he had fallen or clutched at something in haste. Ford, by contrast, was a compact, weathered man of 60, with the air of one whose opinions had been hardened by years of unquestioned service. He stood stiffly, his hands clasped before him, and his gaze, unwavering, fixed somewhere between Holmes's boots and the right-hand gravestone. "Good evening, gentlemen," Holmes said mildly, his cane tapping once against the turf. "You will forgive this intrusion into your devotions, Mr. Hargreave. The world is seldom content to let religion rest undisturbed, particularly when the devil chooses to masquerade as Providence. Now, if you please, each of you shall tell us in your own words how the young lady came to vanish." Lestrade grunted, motioning them on. "The curate first. We've heard the tale once, but Mr. Holmes has his own way of picking the bones clean." Hargreave's Adam's apple jerked. "It was near 4 o'clock, sir. The rain had just begun, and the air was, well, it felt as if the sky pressed close upon us. Miss Wetherall placed her flowers upon the grave, and confound it, I turned to draw my handkerchief from my pocket. It took but an instant, yet when I looked again, she was not there. The place between the stones was empty, and Ford was calling her name as though she had stepped behind him." Holmes inclined his head, studying the man with eyes as sharp as flint. "You did not move toward her when she vanished?" I ran forward, of course. I thought she had fainted. But there was no sign. The grass was disturbed where she had stood, and Ford was shouting something about the ground sinking, though it seemed solid enough underfoot." "Indeed, you say you used your handkerchief. Did you drop it, perhaps?" "No, I still have it." The curate drew it forth, immaculately folded, white linen with a faint trace of rose scent. Holmes took it delicately, turned it between finger and thumb, and returned it. "Rose water," he murmured. "Not violet. A man's scent borrowed from a lady's influence, or perhaps a lady's touch upon a man's property. Curious. And you, Ford, tell me what you saw." The butler's voice was gravelly, every word measured. "I saw Miss Eliza walk to the spot, sir, and bend her head in prayer. I swear on my service she stood there one moment and was gone the next. No scream, no motion, no shadow. It was as if she'd been taken up." Holmes's brows twitched. "Taken up? An interesting choice." "You looked away?" "No, sir, never. My old eyes are slow, but not blind. I saw the hem of her cloak shiver, just so," he gestured faintly, "and then nothing but the wet ground." "You are certain there was no one near her?" "Certain, unless it was under her." Holmes's smile flickered like a match before dying. "A remark both honest and profound, Ford. Mr. Hargreave, did Miss Wetherall speak before she vanished?" "She said only one thing, sir. She laid the lilies and whispered, 'Father, forgive them.'" I supposed she referred to her parents. Her grief has been deep since her father's passing. Holmes turned sharply to Colonel Wetherall. Colonel, you mentioned 2 graves, your brother's, and that of your sister-in-law's first husband. What was the history of that arrangement? The Colonel hesitated, the rain pattering softly upon his hat brim. My brother, Edward, married his late wife, Margaret, 5 years after her first husband's death. She insisted that when her time came, she would be buried beside her first husband rather than my brother, a matter of some bitterness. Yet Edward consented, and when he died, he was laid beside them both, separated by a narrow plot that was to remain unoccupied. That strip where Eliza stood is the very space between their resting places. Holmes's face darkened with thought. So the girl stood literally between the living memory of 2 dead men, each tied to one woman. Intriguing symmetry, is it not? Lestrade shifted impatiently. We're not in church, Mr. Holmes. You'll be wanting proof, not poetry. Patience, Lestrade, Holmes replied coolly. Poetry often conceals mathematics of a high order. Tell me, have you questioned the keeper? Aye, and he swears he's seen no strangers near the ground for days, though there's been some repair work, masons' lads patching the far wall. Holmes's eyes flashed. Repair work, indeed. Watson, observe how patterns persist. We have a hollow-sounding stone, fresh lime at a statue's base, carpenters perhaps, and masons at hand. I think we begin to see the skeleton beneath the flesh. The curate swallowed audibly. You think, then, that Miss Wetherall was kidnapped? I think she descended rather than ascended, Holmes said. The earth here is no accomplice to miracles. It may be, however, an excellent accomplice to men who work by night. He paced slowly along the line of graves, the lantern swinging from his hand. Mr. Hargreave, when you ran forward, did you stumble? Yes, on the edge of the right-hand grave. The ground seemed uneven. Precisely where the hollow lies. You did not fall? No, but my foot slipped for an instant. Holmes nodded to himself. Then the plank held or was closed again beneath you. Remarkably neat work. Colonel, who among your household might have access to carpenters or masons? Only the estate overseer, a man named Garth. He manages the maintenance of the property. But he is loyal, an ex-sergeant from my regiment. Loyalty, Colonel, is a fine thing, but it is also a mask behind which treachery often sits comfortably. Tell me, did your niece possess money of her own? A small inheritance from her mother? Yes. And did she recently speak of marriage, perhaps? The Colonel stiffened. She has been courted, yes, by this very curate here, but with my blessing. The lantern light struck the curate's cheek, revealing a flush beneath the pallor. Holmes turned on him quietly. Indeed, Mr. Hargreave. You were to marry Miss Wetherall? Yes, sir, though our engagement was not yet public. Her guardian's consent had been given. Holmes's tone sharpened to a scalpel. And yet you let her walk between the graves of 2 men bound to one woman, a space prepared by deceit and filled by trickery, without so much as asking her not to tread there. Either you are a fool, sir, or you are playing a part. Hargreaves' breath caught. You wrong me, Mr. Holmes. I swear by heaven I loved her. Love, sir, has more shades than a London fog. Some love for possession, some for salvation, and others for silence. He stooped once more to the seam at the turf's edge, pressed it lightly, and whispered, The carpenter's work is fresh. Hours, not days. Lestrade, have this ground guarded until dawn. No one enters or leaves. I will return with daylight and instruments fit for excavation. Lestrade gave a grudging nod. You think she's under there? I think, Holmes said, standing, that what lies beneath will answer more questions than any of us wish. And if the letter's writer keeps their midnight promise, they will come to ensure silence. Watson, bring your revolver. I fancy the graveyard will not rest quietly tonight. The hour was nearing midnight when Holmes and I returned to Highgate, our cab wheels hissing along the wet streets. A milky fog hung low, swallowing the lamplight and rendering every tombstone a ghostly silhouette. The constables Lestrade had posted stood like black sentinels at intervals, their breath faint clouds in the chill air. Somewhere beyond the trees, the bells of St. Michael's tolled the quarter hour, each note dissolving into the mist. Holmes said little on the drive, yet I could feel the keen movement of his mind like a clock ticking beneath calm glass. His long fingers drummed lightly upon his knee, and his eyes, though half-lidded, saw everything. The direction of the wind, the rhythm of the horse's stride, even the faint scent of damp stone that seeped through the carriage. When at last we descended before the gate, he turned to me with that faint, sardonic smile I had learned to trust as a sign of danger. "Watson," he said quietly, "if I am not mistaken, we are to receive our promised visitor tonight. I should advise that your revolver remain within easy reach, though we shall not employ it save in the utmost necessity. Men who traffic in graves are generally poor shots, but good cowards." We passed through the gate, and the heavy fog folded around us like a cloak. The lanterns burned low now, their wicks choked by moisture. At the centre of that spectral field lay the two graves, the very place where the girl had vanished. I could still trace the faint seam Holmes had exposed earlier, though the rain had softened its outline. Lestrade waited near the path, stamping his feet against the cold. "You'll find nothing new, Mr. Holmes," he said, his tone grim but weary. "No one's been near the place, not a soul. The men are restless, but I've kept them awake." "Excellent," said Holmes. "Then the ground has had its silence. Let us see if it is ready to speak." He knelt and set down a small leather case, producing a chisel, a lantern with a narrowed shade, and a length of fine cord. His motions were swift but soundless, as if he were an organist preparing his keys. "Watson, hold the light. Thus. Lestrade, keep your men back. If I am correct, we shall not have long to wait." He pressed the chisel edge along the seam, and the earth gave a faint sigh, almost human in its reluctance. Then, with a subtle click, a square of turf lifted like the lid of a chest. Beneath it was darkness, dense, palpable, and moist with the scent of damp wood. Holmes bent closer, drawing the lantern nearer, and I saw what he had suspected, a wooden trap, cleverly hinged against the stone and disguised by a shallow layer of earth. The boards were recent, their edges cut smooth, and their nails unstained by rust. "Remarkable workmanship," Holmes murmured. "Whoever built this knew his craft. Observe, this rope along the hinge meant to pull the trap shut from below, a perfect contrivance for a sudden disappearance." Lestrade swore under his breath. "Good Lord, she was pulled down alive?" Holmes's expression did not alter. "Perhaps, or she stepped upon it unknowing. Either way, the mechanism was ready for her. Watson, lend me your hand, we shall lift it carefully." Together we raised the plank, revealing a narrow shaft descending perhaps 6 feet, lined with bricks blackened by age. At its base, a short tunnel slanted away into darkness. The air that rose from it was cold and heavy with mildew. Holmes tied the cord about a nearby post and lowered himself without hesitation, his boots striking the bricks below. "Come, Watson," he called softly. "Mind your footing." The descent was unpleasant, the air close and damp. My lantern illuminated a passage no broader than a coffin, running beneath the graves and curving toward the western wall of the cemetery. It was just high enough for a man to crouch within. The walls bore traces of tools, fresh scratches, mortar dust, and here and there a stray splinter of wood. Holmes moved like a shadow, pausing to examine a footprint left in the thin layer of soil. "A man's boot, size 9, he said. "Square heel, heavy tread, likely a workman's shoe. And beside it, note this, Watson, a smaller print, the pattern of a lady's sole. Miss Eliza has passed this way." "Then she lives?" I whispered. "For the moment, yes. The soil is moist, yet these impressions have not filled with water. She walked here within the last 12 hours. Come." We followed the tunnel as it sloped downward. Presently it widened into a cramped chamber where the smell of earth gave way to that of candle wax and stale air. A single stub of candle burned in an iron bracket, casting grotesque shadows on the brick walls. Against one side stood a crude bench and a small chest, its lid half open. Inside lay a hammer, nails, and several coils of rope, each neatly wound and tied with the same coarse brown twine Holmes had pocketed earlier. He examined them silently, then picked up a scrap of paper from the floor. It was part of an envelope, torn hastily, and upon it was the faint trace of the same ladder symbol that had adorned the Colonel's ransom note. Holmes studied it under the lantern's glow. "The craftsman again," he murmured. "The maker marks his trade. Whoever orchestrated this affair values symbols as much as secrecy. That is vanity, Watson, the kind that leads even clever men to ruin." We pressed on. The tunnel curved once more, ending abruptly behind a pile of broken stone where a low iron door stood ajar. Beyond it, a faint glimmer of moonlight filtered through iron bars, the outer boundary of the cemetery's catacombs. Holmes stepped closer, peering through the opening, and uttered a quiet exclamation. "Look there!" At the far end, half concealed behind a slab, a young woman's figure lay upon a cloak, her head turned to one side, her hair unbound, her face pale but peaceful. Holmes knelt instantly, his hand upon her wrist. "Alive," he said softly, relief slipping beneath his composure. "Weak, but alive. The pulse is steady. She has been drugged, not harmed. Watson, your flask." I obeyed, pressing a few drops of brandy to her lips. Her eyelids fluttered faintly. "She'll wake soon," I murmured. "But why here? Why leave her?" "Because her captors will return," Holmes said. "They meant to ransom her under the pretext of death, but something went awry. Perhaps they feared discovery. Perhaps the mechanism failed. They will come to finish what they began." He stood and extinguished the candle with a swift motion. "We shall remain until they do." The fog above pressed downward, the silence growing thick. Then, faintly from beyond the tunnel's mouth, came the echo of a single footstep. Holmes's eyes gleamed in the darkness. "Steady, Watson," he whispered. "The midnight visitor has kept his word." The sound was soft, just the scrape of a boot, sole on damp stone, but in that close, airless darkness it seemed to reverberate from every direction. Holmes's hand went up in warning, and I felt his other press lightly against my shoulder. The young woman lay still upon her cloak, her breathing shallow but steady. Holmes motioned to the extinguished candle, then to the shadowed alcove beside the tunnel's curve. We slipped into it soundlessly, the lantern shielded beneath my coat, leaving only a thread of dim moonlight from the barred vent to guide our eyes. The steps drew nearer. Whoever approached moved cautiously, pausing at intervals as though listening. There was the faint metallic clink of tools against stone, and then a glow, small at first, then larger as a lantern's hood lifted. Its yellow light revealed a man of medium build dressed in workman's clothes, his face half hidden by a woolen scarf. He carried a spade and what looked like a canvas satchel slung over his shoulder. He advanced toward the girl, muttering under his breath. Holmes's lips moved soundlessly beside me. Observe the gait, measured, not labourers. Educated, I think. And the hands, Watson, see how clean they are. The man set down the satchel and crouched beside Miss Wetherall, removing a small vial from his pocket. The light struck his face fully then, and I caught a glimpse of pale, narrow features and a fine mouth drawn tight with resolve. He was no common ruffian. "Now," Holmes whispered, and stepped from the shadows. "A dangerous hour for graveside errands, Mr. Hargreave." The curate started violently, the vial slipping from his grasp and shattering on the stones. His eyes darted from Holmes to me and then to the girl. You followed me?" he gasped. "Followed?" Holmes's tone was silk over steel. "No, sir, I merely came before you. I anticipated that the gentleman who prayed for the lady's safety by day would seek to ensure her silence by night. You are a man of peculiar devotion." Hargreave staggered back, one hand raised, as if to ward off a blow. "You know nothing. You meddle in things beyond your ken, Holmes. I came to save her, to take her away from them." "From whom?" Holmes advanced a pace, his shadow falling across the man's face. "You constructed the mechanism, or at least supervised it. The cut turf, the hinged plank, the concealed passage, all executed by hands less refined than yours, but guided by your design. Do not feign righteousness now. No, you do not understand." His voice broke, and for an instant he seemed more frightened than guilty. "They forced me. She was to marry me. And they said if I did not help, they would ruin her name. I only meant to hide her, to keep her safe until they relented." Holmes's eyes glinted like a blade catching firelight. "You expected us to believe that a man hides his betrothed in a graveyard tunnel to preserve her honour? No, Mr. Hargreave, you are lying, though not entirely. There are others above you, I think. Others who found your sentimentality convenient. Who are they?" The curate's gaze flickered toward the tunnel entrance, then back to Holmes. "It's no use. He'll kill me if I speak." "Then I must ensure he does not." Holmes's tone was calm, almost kind. "Watson, keep your revolver trained on the passage. Mr. Hargreave, you have half a minute to remember that a gallows is less forgiving than I am." For a moment the only sound was Miss Wetherall's faint breathing and the distant drip of water. Then Hargreave whispered, "It was Garth, the Colonel's overseer. He planned it. Said she must disappear for a while, that there was money to be gained if she were thought dead. I swear I never meant her harm." Holmes's face hardened. "Garth? The loyal ex-sergeant? He stands to profit through the Colonel's estate, if the niece's inheritance reverts. Very tidy. And the letter, no doubt, his attempt to control the narrative." He drew a quick breath and turned to me. "Watson, watch him closely. Lestrade must have men near the north wall. I will fetch them." But before he could move, another sound split the silence, a faint scrape from the tunnel mouth, followed by the unmistakable creak of a board above. Holmes froze, his head tilting. Too late. He comes to finish both accomplice and victim. He extinguished the lantern entirely, plunging us into near darkness, save for the weak silver of moonlight through the bars. We could hear the measured descent of boots on brick steps, deliberate and steady. Then a voice, low, rough, and assured. "Are you there, Reverend? Make haste. The girl must be gone before dawn." Hargreave's breath hitched. "Garth! He's here!" Holmes's whisper cut through the air. "Not a sound. Let him commit himself." The overseer appeared a moment later, lantern in one hand and revolver in the other. He was a broad-shouldered man with cropped hair and the implacable calm of one accustomed to command. His eyes went straight to Hargreave and the motionless figure of the girl. "So," he said, "you did come. I had my doubts about your nerve. It seems our little arrangement has grown crowded." Holmes stepped forward then, his voice as crisp as a pistol shot. "Indeed, Mr. Garth, the kind of crowd that precedes arrest." The lantern swung toward him, and Garth's gun came up instantly. "Holmes! I should have guessed, you meddling vulture." "Put down the weapon," I said, my revolver levelled. The overseer laughed softly, a dangerous sound. "Two against one in a tunnel. You've no room to aim, Doctor." Holmes's tone did not waver. "Perhaps, but there are also 3 constables waiting above, and I have no objection to shouting your name." For the first time the man hesitated. His eyes flicked toward the tunnel mouth, calculating. Then he moved, not to shoot, but to swing the lantern at us, plunging the chamber into darkness as glass shattered. In that instant came a struggle, a rush of movement, the scent of oil and earth, a grunt, and the crack of a single shot that deafened me. When I recovered my bearings, Holmes stood over Garth, whose revolver lay several feet away. The man clutched his shoulder, cursing through clenched teeth. Hargreave had fallen to his knees, shaking. "A superficial wound," Holmes said curtly to me. "Bind it, Watson. Lestrade will want him alive." He turned to the curate. "And you, sir, will have the chance to atone by truth. You will lead us through every step of your conspiracy, from the carpenter's first stroke to the forged letter. Do you understand?" Hargreave bowed his head. "I do." "Good, then perhaps Miss Wetherall's name may yet be spared the scandal you nearly bestowed upon it." Above us came the muffled shouts of constables answering Holmes's call. The tunnel filled with lantern light, boots, and the smell of wet night air. As Garth was led away, Holmes stood silent for a long moment beside the sleeping girl, his face unreadable. Then quietly he said, "You see, Watson, how easily love and greed dig the same grave, and how seldom men know which of the two they stand in." The fog had begun to thin by the time the constables escorted the prisoners away. A few grey streaks of dawn were creeping over the distant rooftops of London, lending the cemetery an almost spectral calm after the night's struggle. Holmes stood apart from the bustle, one hand resting lightly upon the broken stone of the crypt wall, his gaze fixed not on the men departing, but on the faint imprint of footprints that led from the open trap toward the tunnel's mouth. I could see that the fire of deduction still burned in him, though the physical peril had passed. "Curious, is it not, Watson," he said at last, "how men leave the marks of their intentions even upon the mud they tread?" Observe, Garth's heel prints turn outward as he entered, his weight heavy on the right foot. That is the stance of one who approaches danger prepared to strike. But these lighter impressions beside them, see how they veer aside in hesitation. Those belong to our reluctant curate. The contrast between resolution and remorse is written here in inches of soil. "You believe Hargreave's confession to be genuine, then?" I asked. Holmes's eyes followed the curve of the prints as they faded into the shadow. "Genuine in fear, not in motive. He told us only what self-preservation permitted. There are pieces still missing, and one cannot ignore that Garth, for all his soldierly bearing, was a tool rather than a brain. No, the intellect behind this affair lies elsewhere. Someone who knows the Wetherall family's fortunes intimately, who could foresee how inheritance and scandal might dance together to his profit." "Colonel Wetherall himself?" I exclaimed. Holmes's smile was slight, but cutting. "You are growing sensational, my dear Watson. No, our colonel is a proud man, but a straightforward one. His tragedy lies in misplaced trust, not villainy. But I should like a word with him before he speaks to the press, for Lestrade, with his usual zeal, will have this story in the morning papers before breakfast. At that moment, a faint stirring drew our attention to the far corner of the vault. Miss Eliza Wetherall had begun to recover consciousness. Her eyelids fluttered, and she gave a faint, bewildered cry as her gaze met mine. I knelt beside her, offering a few more drops of brandy. Holmes stepped closer, his expression softening into one of grave courtesy. "Compose yourself, Miss Wetherall," he said gently. "You are safe now. Your abductors have been secured, and your uncle is on his way here. There is no danger remaining, save perhaps from the truth itself, which we must now untangle." She struggled to sit up, clutching her cloak about her shoulders. I remember. There was the grave, and the ground seemed to give way beneath me. Someone caught my arm, and then a cloth pressed to my face. I tried to cry out, but I could not breathe. After that, nothing. "Did you recognize your assailant?" Her brow furrowed. "I saw only a shadow, a man's outline against the rain. But the scent, yes, I remember the scent. It was violets." Holmes's glance flicked to me. "The finer essence, not the cheap imitation. That narrows it." Then to the girl. "Miss Wetherall, did you ever notice such a perfume before?" She hesitated. "Once. My stepmother, Mrs. Wetherall. She wore it constantly when my father was alive. After his death, she ceased. She said the scent gave her headaches." "Indeed," Holmes murmured, and I saw the gleam of certainty flash behind his calm facade. "Watson, assist her to the air. Lestrade will see her conveyed to safety. I must pay my respects to the Colonel without delay." We emerged into the pallid light of early morning. The mist had retreated to the lower ground, and the distant rumble of carts signalled the waking city. Lestrade met us by the gate, his expression a mixture of fatigue and satisfaction. "You've given us quite the night, Mr. Holmes, both culprits accounted for, the lady safe, and your theories as strange as ever. I'll wager you'll find some way to make even this simple abduction into a web of international intrigue." Holmes's smile was faint. "I have no interest in wagers, Lestrade, though I would counsel you not to close your report too hastily. Your net has caught 2 fish, but the pike remains in the weeds. When you have finished congratulating yourself, send a man to the Wetherall house in Little Venice and ensure that Mrs. Wetherall is apprised of her stepdaughter's recovery. I have a suspicion she will not greet the news with unalloyed delight." Lestrade gave him a sidelong glance. "You think the lady's in it?" "I think," Holmes replied, stepping into the cab that awaited us, "that she may prove the linchpin of the whole affair. Come, Watson, we shall visit the Colonel." The journey to Little Venice was brief. The morning light revealed the canal gleaming like dull steel between the terraces, and the Wetherall residence stood severe and proper behind its iron gate. The Colonel met us at the door himself, his uniform coat thrown hastily over his nightshirt, his eyes haunted yet resolute. "Holmes, my niece—" "Safe, though greatly shaken," Holmes assured him. "She has endured an ordeal that might have ended more tragically but for a miscalculation on her captor's part. I regret to say, however, that one of your own men, Garth, was deeply implicated." The Colonel's face drained of colour. "Garth! Impossible! I trusted him as myself." "Precisely his advantage," Holmes said quietly. "Yet I fear he was not the architect, only the soldier. Tell me, Colonel, has your late brother's widow remained in the house since his death?" "Yes. Margaret would not be persuaded to leave. It was her right, and she keeps to her rooms mostly. My niece rarely visits her. There was, well, a coolness between them." "Over the inheritance?" "Perhaps. My brother's will left the estate to Eliza upon her marriage, with a generous allowance in the meantime. Margaret receives a smaller annuity sufficient for her needs. She resented the arrangement, though I could not alter it. Holmes's gaze sharpened. And Mrs. Wetherell, does she still wear the perfume of violets? The Colonel blinked. She did once. Why do you ask? Holmes smiled thinly. Because that fragrance, Colonel, has followed your family to the graveyard and back again. It clings to deceit as naturally as it does to silk. He turned toward the stairs, his voice low but decisive. Watson, I believe the time has come to speak with Mrs. Wetherell. If my theory is correct, the lady's mourning veil conceals not grief but guilt, and perhaps the key to why a girl was made to vanish between two graves. Holmes ascended the staircase with the quiet assurance of a man entering not a home, but a crime scene. I followed close behind, noting how the Colonel's heavy tread faltered with each step. The house itself seemed suspended in a peculiar hush, the hush of luxury left too long to servants and sorrow. A maid appeared at the landing, pale-faced and uncertain, her eyes darting toward the closed door at the far end of the corridor. Holmes inclined his head to her with that peculiar gentleness he reserved for the frightened or the guiltless. Mrs. Wetherell is within? Yes, sir, the girl whispered. She's not yet dressed for the day, but she bade me admit you if you came. Holmes's glance flickered toward the Colonel. I think it best, sir, that you remain below until I call. There are matters which may wound your sense of honour, and it would be cruel to lay them bare before you unprepared. The Colonel hesitated, his jaw tightening, but after a moment he nodded and descended the stairs in silence. Holmes waited until the sound of his steps faded, then turned the handle. The room was dimly lit. Thick curtains filtered the pale morning light into a half-world of shadow and amber. The air was heavy with the unmistakable scent of violets, the same delicate perfume we had traced from the graveyard. Mrs. Wetherell sat near the fire in a high-backed chair, her widow's veil drawn back, her features fine, but drawn tight with sleeplessness. She was perhaps 40, and there was beauty still in her face, but of the cold and dangerous kind, the beauty that sharpens with calculation rather than fades with grief. Mr. Holmes, she said evenly, I suppose I should thank you for returning my stepdaughter to us, though the manner of her recovery, as the servants recount it, seems to me unnecessarily theatrical. Holmes bowed slightly. Theatre, madam, is the stage upon which crime so often performs. But I confess the credit for recovery belongs less to Providence than to human error. The mechanism intended to conceal her failed, perhaps by your overseer's impatience. Her fingers stilled upon the armrest, though her expression did not change. You speak in riddles, sir? I speak in evidence, said Holmes. He advanced a step, his gaze never wavering. Miss Wetherell was not taken by chance. The scene at Highgate was contrived with precision, one might even say artistry. A false disappearance arranged to cast the illusion of death, and a letter sent to direct suspicion away. The hand that guided it was not Garth's. He lacks the subtlety, nor the curate's. His weakness lay in emotion, not design. It was rather the work of someone whose mind could calculate inheritance, reputation, and fear with equal facility. Her lips curved slightly. And that, you believe, is mine? I do, Holmes said quietly. Your perfume betrayed you before your conscience did. For a long moment the only sound was the faint hiss of the fire. Then she laughed, a low, musical sound devoid of warmth. You mistake me for a melodrama's villainess, Mr. Holmes. Why should I wish the girl harm? She is my husband's child. Precisely, and her existence ensures that your late husband's estate passes out of your control upon her marriage. Until then, you manage the finances, a comfort you have grown accustomed to. But the girl was to wed soon, was she not? To the curate, a man of modest means and pliant temperament, marriage would have meant her independence, and your poverty. Hence the necessity of her disappearance. Death is tidy, but scandal more profitable, for it destroys the living while leaving room to maneuver. The faintest tremor passed through her hand. She turned away, gazing into the fire. A clever tale, Mr. Holmes, yet even your genius cannot conjure proof from perfume. On the contrary, he said, I have more than perfume. Garth's confession places you as the author of his instructions. The violet scent upon the letter matched the one in this room. An essence not sold in England but in a single boutique in Nice, as my analysis this morning confirmed. You purchased it 6 months ago through a French intermediary, and, if you will permit the intrusion, he reached to the small escritoire beside her and lifted a folded sheet of stationery. Your handwriting, madam, is identical to that on the envelope delivered to Colonel Wetherall, even the idiosyncratic curl of your capital M in midnight. Her poise faltered for the first time. You searched my desk? Holmes's voice softened, almost sympathetic. I search only for truth, Mrs. Wetherall, and truth, unlike money, cannot be hidden by a locked drawer. She rose suddenly, the colour draining from her face. You think me a monster, then? I think you desperate, Holmes replied. Desperation is seldom monstrous until it succeeds. You might have chosen many paths, appealed to the Colonel's honour, negotiation, even retreat. Instead, you chose deceit. That choice has cost you your freedom, and nearly cost Miss Wetherall her life. Her eyes flashed. You speak of freedom as if you know what it is. You, a man unbound by family or reputation, who stalks through other lives like a shadow, judging but never feeling. What would you know of the cage a woman endures when her fortune, her very existence, depends on the whims of dead men? Holmes regarded her with something approaching pity. I know, madam, that injustice does not justify crime, nor does intellect excuse cruelty. You are, by your own confession, a prisoner of circumstance, but you chose to build your own cell. She turned sharply toward the door as footsteps approached, the Colonel's, steady and heavy. In that instant her composure collapsed. She pressed a hand to her breast and whispered, Not him, Mr. Holmes. I beg you, let him think it was Garth. He has lost too much already. But Holmes's face was implacable. The truth, Mrs. Wetherall, belongs to all it wounds. The door opened, and the Colonel entered. His eyes passed from Holmes to his wife's ashen face, and I saw in that moment he understood without a word spoken. She sank into her chair, her hand trembling over the violets at her throat. Margaret, he said hoarsely, is it true? Her voice came faintly, like wind through old lace. I wanted only to keep what was mine. Holmes turned away, his tone low and grave. Lestrade will see to the rest, Colonel. There is nothing more to be done here save mercy, and that is not within my profession. As we stepped back into the cold corridor, the scent of violets lingered behind us, sweet yet suffocating. A fitting requiem for the woman who had tried to bury innocence beneath the earth, only to find herself entombed by her own deceit. Holmes descended the stairs in silence, his expression unreadable. The early light streamed through the tall windows of the Wetherall residence, pale and colourless as the aftermath of a storm. Behind us, faint voices rose from the drawing-room, the Colonel's rough baritone interwoven with his wife's broken sobs. The scene we left behind was not one of triumph, but of ruin, the kind of quiet devastation that follows when the veil of deceit is torn away, and the truth stands naked, pitiless, in its place. As we reached the hall, Holmes paused, his hand upon the banister. "Watson," he said softly, "I have often been accused of coldness, but there are moments such as this when I envy those who can afford emotion. Justice is a grim guest. It seldom leaves a house without breaking something fragile." Before I could answer, the door opened and Lestrade entered, brisk and businesslike, despite the fatigue that lined his features. "I've the men waiting outside," he said. "Shall we take her into custody now, or will you be making any more discoveries, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes regarded him with a faint narrowing of the eyes. "Mrs. Wetherell will not flee, Inspector. Her prison is already well constructed within her conscience. But if you wish a formal confession, you may find it soon enough. She will speak not to you, but to her own remorse." Lestrade gave a short nod. "As you say, I've no taste for drama, though it seems to follow you wherever you go." "Drama," Holmes murmured, "is but the echo of truth to an unprepared ear. You may consider the case closed, Lestrade, though its moral remains unfinished." He turned toward the door, and I followed him out into the crisp air. The fog had lifted, revealing the narrow canal below like a ribbon of tarnished glass. A carriage waited at the gate, and as we climbed in, Holmes drew his coat close, the sharp wind tugging at its folds. For several streets he spoke not a word, the rhythmic clatter of hooves and wheels filling the silence between us. At last he said, "There is a peculiar irony in this, Watson. A woman who sought to bury her rival's child alive finds herself figuratively entombed in her own deceit. Yet in her way she is more tragic than villainous. It is the same disease that infects so many who dwell upon the border of comfort and ruin, the fear of losing what they believe they have earned." "You mean greed?" I said. He shook his head slightly. "Not greed alone, fear, vanity, self-preservation, the trinity that makes respectable criminals of ordinary souls. I do not excuse her crime, but I understand it. There was a cold brilliance in her design, too cold for love, too exact for passion. She built her crime like an architect builds a mausoleum, beautiful in symmetry, but dead at its heart." We had reached Baker Street when the cab stopped, and Mrs. Hudson, ever watchful, met us at the door. She seemed startled by Holmes's drawn expression. "You've been out all night, Mr. Holmes. You'll take a chill if you don't rest yourself proper." "Thank you, Mrs. Hudson," he said absently, hanging his hat upon the stand. A chill, however, is more welcome than the heat of folly. "Watson, you'll join me for a cup of coffee. My mind demands occupation, or it will turn upon itself." Inside, the fire burned low. Holmes sank into his armchair, clasped his long fingers beneath his chin, and closed his eyes. The violin lay untouched beside him. For a few minutes there was only the faint ticking of the clock and the muffled sounds of the city waking outside. I was about to speak when he opened his eyes again, that familiar gleam of intellect rekindled. "There remains one question unanswered," he said. "Why did Mrs. Wetherell act when she did? She had lived under the same roof as the girl for months without lifting a hand against her. What changed?" "Perhaps the impending marriage," I ventured. "Precisely, the curate's influence. Hargreave was the instrument of her panic, but I suspect his involvement was not purely accidental. A woman such as Mrs. Wetherell would not confide in a servant, but she might manipulate a sentimental clergyman under the guise of moral authority. She must have appealed to his pity, perhaps even to his affection, convincing him that removing the girl temporarily would protect her from scandal or worldly temptation. In his weakness, he became both accomplice and scapegoat. And Garth? Ah, Garth was her practical agent, the hand to execute the plan, while Hargreave served as its moral disguise. Between them, she built a perfect illusion, a spiritual rescue and a physical disappearance. Only the smallest miscalculation destroyed it. A hinge too swift to close, a note too scented, a conscience too weak. He rose abruptly and began to pace, the firelight glancing off his sharp features. What fascinates me, Watson, is not the crime itself, but its psychological architecture. Each element of deceit reflected some fragment of her inner world. The graves symbolized her divided loyalties, the first husband, the second, the living child caught between. Her mind sought symmetry even in guilt. She staged the girl's vanishing between two tombs because, in her own heart, that was precisely where she stood, between love remembered and love lost. "You make her sound almost pitiable," I said. Holmes stopped before the window, watching a milk cart pass below. "I do pity her. Pity, Watson, is the luxury of those who stand outside the labyrinth. The moment one steps within, pity becomes perilous. Remember that." We sat for a long while, the morning brightening beyond the window. At length there came a knock at the door, and Lestrade entered once more, hat in hand. His manner was subdued. "I thought you'd wish to know, Mr. Holmes. Mrs. Wetherall is dead. She took poison shortly after you left. The maid found her a half-hour ago." For a long moment Holmes did not speak. His face remained impassive, but his eyes darkened. "And the Colonel?" "Stricken, but he'll live," Lestrade replied. "He's asked that the matter be kept quiet, for the lady's sake and the girl's. I'll see that the papers speak only of the overseer's arrest." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "That will be wise. The public has no appetite for tragedies that cannot entertain them." When Lestrade had gone, the silence returned, heavier now. Holmes moved to the hearth and stared into the fading coals. "So ends the affair," he said at last. "A crime born of calculation concludes in impulse. She planned everything save her own." "Remorse." I rose, unable to bear the gloom that had settled. "You did all that could be done, Holmes." He smiled faintly, his voice barely above a whisper. "That, my dear Watson, is the tragedy of my trade. I find the truth, but I cannot mend the hearts it breaks." He turned back to the fire, and as the grey morning light crept across Baker Street, I could not help but think that Sherlock Holmes, who solved the mysteries of men's deeds, would forever remain baffled by the mysteries of their souls. The day after Mrs. Wetherall's tragic death was one of those strange intervals when London itself seemed subdued, as though the city were aware of some quiet reckoning taking place within it. The rain had ceased, but a thin grey mist hung low over Baker Street, softening the edges of chimneys and rooftops. Holmes sat at his desk, a cigar smouldering idly between his fingers, the ash long and unbroken. The silence in the room was heavy enough to draw my notice. It was not the silence of rest, but of thought, circling endlessly around an unfinished question. "She has taken her punishment into her own hands," Holmes said at length, his voice low, almost abstract. "And yet, Watson, the dead seldom tell us everything. Mrs. Wetherall died before she could answer the one question that still gnaws at the edges of logic." I laid aside the morning paper, where the incident had been reduced to a column of dull print. "You mean her motive? You've already said it. Fear and greed." "Fear, yes," he murmured. "But not for herself. There was something in her last words. Let him think it was Garth. It was not guilt for her own crime that broke her. It was the fear of discovery by someone she sought to protect. She said, 'He has lost too much already.' She spoke of the Colonel, of course, but not in the manner of a guilty wife. There was pity in it, not remorse, which leads me to wonder if she was not protecting him rather than herself. "You suspect Colonel Wetherall?" I asked in disbelief. "Surely not after his shock, his grief." "Actors, Watson, can weep at will, but soldiers conceal their feelings until the battle is done. I observed him when I revealed his wife's perfidy. His reaction was too contained, too measured for a man whose world had just collapsed. His pulse did not quicken, his gaze did not waver. He had already suspected her, or perhaps knew far more than either of us." He rose abruptly and began to pace. "Consider the sequence, my dear fellow. Garth, the overseer, acts under the colonel's authority. The colonel had every opportunity to direct his work under the pretext of estate business. Mrs. Wetherall may have conceived the scheme, but she would need means, tools, strength, access to the grounds, and those, I suspect, were granted by her husband's ignorance, or perhaps his permission. But why should the colonel wish his niece dead? I demanded. He seemed devoted to her. Holmes stopped, turning his piercing gaze upon me. Exactly so. Devotion may turn dark when inheritance and honour stand in opposition. You recall his words in our first interview. There are two graves for one family history, and it is an unhappy arrangement. There was bitterness there, Watson, old bitterness. Suppose his brother's death was not as innocent as it seemed. Suppose the colonel, driven by envy or rivalry, had once coveted both his brother's fortune and his wife. Miss Eliza's inheritance would be a constant reminder of that past. Mrs. Wetherall, bound by affection or guilt, may have consented to aid him. And when the plan turned foul, when the girl was found alive, the woman's conscience awoke, too late to save either herself or her husband. The theory struck me like a physical blow. Holmes, you cannot mean— I mean nothing until proof dictates, he interrupted sharply, but proof, I think, awaits us still at Highgate. He flung on his coat with sudden resolve. The dead speak more clearly than the living when one knows how to listen. Come, Watson, we shall call once more upon the graves between which a girl was lost and found. The cab carried us through the damp morning streets to the familiar iron gates. The cemetery lay hushed beneath a thin mist, the air scented faintly of wet yew and soil. The constable stationed there saluted us as we entered. Holmes strode ahead with his long, determined stride, every line of his body alive with purpose. When we reached the spot where the trapdoor had been uncovered, Holmes paused. The turf had been replaced and the area cordoned off by police, but the marks of the recent disturbance remained. He knelt, brushing away the loose soil with a gloved hand. "Watson, note how the edges have been reset, not by Lestrade's men. Someone else has been here since yesterday." "Impossible. The place is guarded." "Guards have eyes, but rarely imagination," Holmes murmured. "Observe this. Ashes. Still faintly warm. Someone burned paper here." He scooped up the charred fragments with delicate precision. Among them, a sliver of parchment survived, bearing only a few legible words. "Forgive them. E.W." "Eliza Wetherall's initials," I breathed. "But she could not have written this. She's under care at her uncle's house." Holmes's expression hardened. "No, Watson, not her hand. The strokes are too firm, the ink too heavy. These were written by a man, the colonel perhaps, or someone wishing to suggest her absolution. A theatrical gesture, a farewell, or a cover." He stood, the fragment fluttering in his hand like a black feather. If the colonel was involved, he may now be destroying evidence to preserve his honour, or to silence her memory. He turned sharply toward the constable. "You saw no one enter this ground this morning?" "No, sir," the man said, uneasy. "Only the colonel, just after sunrise. He said he came to lay flowers." Holmes's eyes met mine, as I feared. Come, Watson, we must return to Little Venice at once. The journey back was swift and silent. When we arrived, the house stood strangely still, the curtains drawn though it was full daylight. The door yielded to Holmes's touch, unlocked. Inside, the air was thick with the same scent of violets that had haunted us from the first. In the study, Colonel Wetherall sat slumped at his desk, his hand resting upon an open letter. The pistol beside him told the rest. Holmes moved forward with grim composure, lifted the sheet, and read aloud. I could not let her bear the shame alone. It was my will that began it, my pride that made her desperate. Forgive her and think kindly of me, for I have loved no one wholly but her. The girl lives, that must suffice. Between the graves I buried only my honour. Holmes folded the letter without comment, his face unreadable. For a long time he stood by the window, watching the grey light fall upon the still form of the soldier who had chosen silence over disgrace. At last he said quietly, "So ends the matter, Watson. 2 lives spent to preserve 1 illusion. The girl's innocence saved her body, but their guilt destroyed their souls. The graves were well chosen after all. Between them, the living learned what the dead already knew, that truth cannot be buried without the grave claiming its maker." He replaced his hat, his voice fading into the hush of the room. "Come, my dear fellow. There is nothing more to be done here. The case is solved, but like so many of its kind, not one. It fell to us to bear the news to Miss Eliza, and of all the offices I have performed in my association with Holmes, none has weighed more heavily upon me. We found her in a small sitting-room overlooking the canal, a shawl about her shoulders, the sun, pale and watery, struggling through the lace to set trembling patterns on her lap. Her face had taken on that peculiar translucence one sees after a grave fever. Her eyes, too wide for their sockets, watched us enter with the composure of one who anticipates pain and chooses to stand still for it. Holmes bowed with unusual formality. "Miss Wetherall, your courage last night was not given its due. I must ask more of it now. Your stepmother is dead. She chose her own end. Your uncle, Colonel Wetherall, followed her this morning. He has left a letter which, for your sake, will not see the newspapers." She did not cry out. Her hand found the arm of her chair and held it. I took my position by the hearth and stared into the coal's dull glow, for I had no wish to add my gaze to her burden. After a moment that seemed carved from marble, she said, Did either of them mean me harm?" Holmes's answer was gentle and remorseless. "They meant to smother a difficulty with secrecy. The trap was built to convey you away unseen, and fear did the rest. No lasting harm was intended, so they told themselves, but crimes so designed often forget to reckon with the vast, implacable arithmetic of consequence. When a contrivance is set among graves, it has a way of choosing its own conclusion." Her mouth trembled, but she mastered it. "And Mr. Hargreave?" "Out of danger, though not out of the dock," said Holmes. "He will be charged as an accessory. His part was timid and foolish, but not, I think, malicious. It remains with you whether you wish to see him again." She closed her eyes. A single tear escaped and crossed her cheek like a signature. "I shall not," she whispered. "Whatever he meant, he helped bury me alive." Holmes inclined his head. "Then the living will take their places among the living, and the dead will be allowed their silence. There is one service I may render yet. If you permit it, I shall speak with your solicitor to ensure your name is protected and your property restored without the stain of rumour. Lestrade has shown a rare discretion. The narrative for the public will be confined to the overseer's villainy and the fortunate recovery of a missing lady." "You are very kind, Mr. Holmes." "I am exact," he returned. Kindness is a sentiment. Exactness, when it saves a reputation, does the work of kindness without boasting of it. When we left her, the canal had taken on a fragile glimmer, as if some covert warmth were trying the locks. Holmes said nothing until we were in the cab, and then, with that scholar's tone he reserved for summaries, he gave the case its skeleton in a few clean strokes. Mark the progression, Watson. Motive born of pressure, instrument found in proximity, cover devised by taste. Mrs. Wetherall supplied the plan and the persuasion. Her vanity lodged, as we observed, in perfume and in symbols. The ladder sign upon the letter was an artisan's brand borrowed to suggest a guild of workmen rather than a lady's drawing-room. Garth brought tools, labour, and a soldier's calm. He cut the turf and eased the brick, hinged the plank along the stone's edge, and left a cord below to snap the lid shut. Hargreaves served as moral camouflage, a priestly figure to stand beside the scene and swear that nothing earthly had intervened. The violet trace upon the grass betrayed her presence. The hollow note of the right-hand stone betrayed his work. Between these the whole deception hung, waiting for a girl's wait and an instant's turn. "And the Colonel?" I asked. "His letter is the final pin in the map," said Holmes. "He knew, aided, or at the least permitted. He had the authority to move men about the grounds under pretence of repairs, and the habit of command that suffers itself to become permission. He loved his wife with the love of a proud man, one that can be led to cruelty when honour is threatened. The scheme, once begun, became a tide neither had the courage to stem. When the tide receded and left their footprints, clearly visible upon the mud, they chose the sea. Back at Baker Street, Lestrade awaited us with the air of a man who has wrestled with both his conscience and his superior, and finds the former the more obstinate. "I've taken your advice, Mr. Holmes. The papers will print what I tell them and nothing more. Garth goes up for conspiracy and assault. The curate, well, the magistrate will show leniency if the lady asks it. She won't, you say? Then at least he will keep his collar and his distance." "Let him keep his soul if he can," said Holmes, "that his property seldom returned once pawned." Lestrade shifted, uncomfortable in the vicinity of philosophy. "You'll give me the whole string of it for the files?" Holmes spoke without flourish, laying out the sequence with a draftsman's completeness. He added, almost as an afterthought, the detail that had struck him first. "The seam," he said. "It was too perfect. Real ground is never perfect. In crime, Watson, one must look always for what is too straight, too clean, too neat. Excess is the silhouette of intention." When the inspector had gone and the house resumed its ordinary pulse, Holmes took up the violin, tuned a string that had fallen half a note in the night's damp, and played a phrase so spare it seemed less a melody than a line drawn in air. He set the instrument down as one sets down a verdict. "You will write this, I suppose," he said. "If the family permits," I answered. "Not all our cases can bear the light." "Then set down one thing clearly, that the miracle of vanishing was no miracle at all, and that what men call fate is often only the geometry of their own devices. Put also, if your moral sense insists, that the most efficient prisons are not built of stone, but of ideas. Mrs. Wetherall dwelt in one, the Colonel in another. They built a third for the girl. We knocked its door aside." He leaned back, steepling his fingers. The afternoon had shifted. A bar of sun lay across the Persian rug like a bookmark. "I shall take to my bees for a week," he murmured. "Urban tragedy spoils the palate. There is an honesty in the hive that our species struggles to achieve." "And if another case comes?" He smiled, the old quicksilver glint lighting his eyes. "Then we shall be at our posts, my dear fellow. London's imagination does not tire, and where it goes astray we shall follow, correcting its romance with a small, bracing dose of truth. That evening, as the lamps were lit and the city resumed its customary noise, a note arrived by special messenger. It was written in a clear, steady hand and bore no scent at all. "Mr. Holmes," it read, "I have chosen to leave London. There is nothing for me here but memories that do not know how to be kind. If ever I am able to be grateful without weeping, I shall be so to you. Until then, I carry your exactness with me, as one might carry a light in a fog." E. W. Holmes folded the paper and slipped it into a drawer without comment. Yet, later, when the street was quiet and the coal burned down to its last red eye, I saw him glance toward that drawer and smile with that rare expression which no client of his ever purchased, a look in which even his keen mind allowed itself, for an instant, the mercy of feeling. It was late evening when I sat once more across from Holmes in our familiar sitting-room at Baker Street, the lamps casting long, warm shadows upon the cluttered table where pipe ash mingled with newspaper cuttings and forgotten telegrams. Outside, the murmur of London went on, omniscient, indifferent, alive. Within, there lingered that peculiar stillness which always followed the closing of a great case. Holmes had taken up his violin but held it absently, the bow resting against the strings as though the melody within him had not yet chosen to be born. He spoke at last, not looking up. "You perceive, Watson, how thin the veil is between tragedy and order, between what men call justice and what I call inevitability. I confess this affair leaves me less satisfied than most. There was logic, yes, proof and deduction at every turn, but no triumph. We have restored truth, yet truth itself has the melancholy taste of ashes when it comes too late to save." I leaned forward. "You mean to say you regret your intervention?" "Regret?" He smiled faintly, shaking his head. "No, my dear fellow. One cannot regret the alignment of fact, but it is one thing to unravel the machinery of guilt and another to watch it grind the human heart to powder. The Wetherell case will not be remembered for its cleverness, though it had that in abundance. It will be remembered, by us at least, as a reminder that deception, like architecture, can be beautiful, but beauty built on rot must collapse." He rose then, restless, moving toward the window. The fog was thick again, curling against the glass like a living thing. "Observe London, Watson. 1,000 chimneys, each a little empire of secrets. Beneath that fog lie 100 crimes, most of which will never come to me, and a few which should never come to any man. And yet, somewhere in that vast expanse there are still the innocent, Miss Eliza among them, struggling toward the light. That, perhaps, is why I persist." "Miss Wetherell has left England," I said quietly. Her letter was brief, but there was hope in it. "She will find peace in time." Holmes nodded, though his gaze remained fixed upon the drifting vapour outside. "She will heal because she was not built for falsehood. It is the liars who perish of their own devices. The Colonel sought honour in silence, and it destroyed him. His wife sought safety in deceit, and it unmade her. Between them stood the girl, the living proof that one may survive truth, but not the lack of it." For a time he said nothing more. The clock on the mantel ticked its patient rhythm, and I thought the case, like the day, had reached its quiet end. But Holmes's mind is never content to sleep on victory or defeat. It circles the embers until every spark is known. He turned suddenly, his expression brightened by that peculiar gleam that had so often preceded revelation. "There was one final matter, Watson, the detail that confirms the entire architecture of the affair." I raised an eyebrow. "Another clue?" "A confirmation," he said. his tone crisp again, alive with precision. "Do you recall the Latin motto on Edward Wetherall's stone, Quo Teneum? It translates loosely to, by what shall I hold? A question, not an answer. His brother chose that inscription, you remember, and I think now that choice was no accident. It was the silent confession of a man who knew his grasp on virtue was slipping, the graves, the symmetry, the very position of the girl between them. It was all his unspoken metaphor. In seeking to hold his honor, he held nothing. That is the tragedy of the soldier who mistakes silence for duty." I sat back, struck anew by the eerie precision with which Holmes could transform coincidence into meaning. Then even his final act, his confession, was his attempt to answer that question? Just so, and he answered wrongly. Holmes's gaze softened, and for the first time that night, the violin found its voice. A slow, plaintive phrase filled the air, delicate as mist rising from the Thames. "The proper answer, Watson, is not by silence, nor by secrecy, but by truth. One must hold by truth, however sharp its edge." The melody lingered, drifting through the room like the ghost of what had been lost. When he lowered the bow, the last note faded into the steady murmur of the city below, where carriage wheels turned and footsteps passed, each an echo of unseen stories that might one day cross our threshold. Holmes turned from the window, his features illuminated briefly by the fire's glow. "You see, my dear fellow, in the end the case was never about death, but about burial. They buried trust beneath suspicion, love beneath pride, and conscience beneath fear. The girl alone rose from the grave because she alone had nothing to hide." He set the violin aside and reached for his pipe. "There will be another summons soon enough. London never sleeps and folly never learns. Until then, let us be grateful for the quiet." I watched him as the smoke curled upward in slow, ghostly spirals. Outside, the fog thickened once more, enfolding Baker Street in its eternal shroud. Yet within that small room there remained a sense of order, of fragile balance. Holmes in his chair, the fire steady, the city murmuring beyond the glass. And I thought, not for the first time, that so long as Sherlock Holmes sat there, pipe in hand, the world, however dark, would not lose its shape entirely. For there, at the centre of all confusion, was reason itself, a light that flickered but never went out,